Wow, this is fun. I'm seeing folks' responses come in real time. You all are taking your time to decide how you feel about the weather. Really giving your chance to sit on it. All right. Feel free to keep thinking. If you just can't decide if this is your least favorite or your absolute favorite weather, you have time to decide if it's still there. I'll go ahead and move us into the RCG team introductions, which means specifically starting my PowerPoint. Oh, no. Did I pull?
My IT has
Not
blocked.
able. Oh, this is actually great. It's fine. Don't worry. I already built this into the storytelling for today, and you've just made it more part of the storytelling. So this is good. Remember this. We'll come back to it. All right. This is a good introduction to evidence and data, actually. Okay. So by now, it's likely the case that many, if not most of you, have interacted with one of the 4 RCG teammates who are here today. That's myself, Rita, Abby, and Hannah. But just to give us all a moment to remember who's in the room, Rita, Abby, and Hannah, would you all mind turning on your cameras and just quickly saying hello and introducing your role on the team? I will first start it off maybe with Rita.
Thanks, Casey. Hi, everyone. My name is Rita Chang. I use she, her pronouns. I serve as the grants manager for the RCG team and the Strategy and Partnerships Division at WSAC. I'll pass the mic off to Abby.
Hi there, good afternoon. Good to see everyone again. My name's Abby Roth. My pronouns are she, her. With our more emerging and forming partnerships in our cohort. Back to you, Casey.
Thank you so much. And I will round us out. I am Casey. I use she, her pronouns, and I am the 4th member of the RCG team and the one who you will hear from most often as the partnerships that you work with serve as evidence of learning and impact. Though I am formally a member of WSAC's research team, it is my great honor to get to spend much of my time in partnership with other agency divisions supporting ongoing learning and evaluation across WSAC. One part of that work is the support that I provide Regional Challenge Grant and its partnerships. This shows up in a number of ways, which you will see all too often in your inboxes, but today the focus is on the short-term outcomes and the process we use to develop these outcomes. I am also deeply honored to get to introduce my colleague Jonathan, who works alongside me as part of this process. So Jonathan, I'll hand it over to you to introduce yourself as well.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Casey, and everyone for the opportunity to share space with you all. Jonathan Davis, in my current role with WSAC, I am an evaluation consultant, so behind the scenes really working with Casey and the rest of the team to think strategically about best ways and approaches to one, uphold the current vision and mission of RCG and the ways in which RCG as a team and as a staff engages with you all, but more squarely to think through best approaches and how we share the story of the great work that you're doing in ways that situate you all as experts in that sharing, in that storytelling. So deeply excited about today's conversation because we get to do some of that in real time together.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. And it is my sincere hope that as you start to work with the whole team here, that includes Jonathan. So if his name shows up in your inbox, know that it's because we are so glad to be able to fold him into the family of folks who are working on RCG every day in the agency. Okay, so today, we're going to spend some time walking through RCG's approach to the short-term outcomes. As a quick agenda, what that means is we're going to talk about why we measure short-term outcomes in the Regional Challenge Grant Program, how we go about measuring these outcomes in a way that honors the role that each of you play as experts in your community, as Jonathan just said. We'll also walk through some examples together, and spoiler alert, I will ask for additional audience participation, not through a poll. Don't worry, you'll get to just use the chat. I will also overview for this process so that we can leave time at the end here today where both Jonathan and I will be available in separate breakout rooms just in case you do want to get a head start on this process by asking questions that are specific to your partnership. But before we get in, one very specific FYI about an email that will be coming to your inbox. In the next week or so, each partnership's primary point of contact will receive from the RCG team an email request to confirm that the school districts that are included in the geographic footprint of your service region. This request is motivated by a very specific reporting requirement. We are legislatively required to report key population level outcomes for all regions served by RCG investments, where these outcomes are high school graduation, direct to college enrollment, and post-secondary completion. We believe that all RCG partnerships work is going to lead to improvements in enrollment and attainment for the communities served by your work, and we know that this very narrow set of outcomes may not capture what's happening in your work and in your learning. For instance, if you work with adult learners, it's not going to mean much to capture high school graduation rates as it relates directly to the work that you're doing. And that's one of the reasons why this short-term outcomes process that we're discussing today is so important. Even so, because this is one of the very few legislatively required reporting pieces that we need to do, we want to do it in a way that most faithfully captures what you believe to be the geography where you operate. And for these population level outcomes, we think the best starting place is to just ask you where you think those school districts are. So as you identify these school districts in that email that you'll get from us, don't hesitate to follow back up with questions, concerns, thoughts. Know that this is a very small part of the reporting, and everything that follows is what we believe to be the true storytelling of what's happening within the Regional Challenge Grant Program's partnerships. Okay. Now on to why we're actually here today, which is the content of the short-term outcomes process. The why and the how is where we're going to start, and what does it actually mean? Like, what is a short-term outcome for a Regional Challenge Grant Partnership? I will say, actually, so ahead of this discussion, I am grateful that each of you were willing to rate your weather if you were able, and that some of you dropped in the chat how you were feeling about your weather today. Not only because that tells us a little bit about how you're feeling. I'm really sorry, especially for those of you who don't love the clouds. I also have clouds and rain where I've been, and that's also not what I've wanted today. But this process, the idea here is that it can remind us how every source of evidence is limited in what it can convey. That is especially true if you cannot answer the poll. If you cannot submit your data, then who we can speak to when it comes to this evidence is even more limited. So asking folks to rate their weather is a great way to understand how they feel about it, but in the absence of understanding what that local weather is, we can't definitively say that everyone here loves the sun, loves the rain, et cetera, et cetera. It takes a lot of dynamic evidence, not just one single data point to tell our stories, and that is true of our partnerships as well. Okay, so let's start with why. We work with partners to co-design these individualized short-term outcomes for, at a minimum, 3 reasons. The first is because these outcomes become an avenue for uplifting stories and evidence from our partnerships in a way that is true to the community and your context. It's also true that capturing these indicators of change becomes a way that we can support you as you identify key learning that helps you adapt your work over time and as the environment in which you operate changes. And third, because it is our goal to make the case for continued investment in RCG, both as a program and in the partnerships that together comprise that RCG portfolio. But we don't prescribe a single set of outcomes for all partnerships. We talked about those population level metrics. Those are not your outcomes. We also don't prescribe a single approach to measurement for all partnerships because that's really not ours to decide. Our goal is not to create a decontextualized accountability structure because we know that there are dozens of arenas where each partnership's day-to-day work, day-to-day impact will show up. And we want to identify those indicators so that we can accurately elevate your impact. So how, and I just want to check, partner, I just saw your text come in. I'm still seeing the RCG team. You should see a different slide.
Casey, it's working for me. If it works for you, I could include the slide deck as an attachment in the comments for a promise.
We can absolutely send it out afterwards.
Yeah.
I just want to make sure that we've cleaned up on the back end what's happening. But thank you. Let us know if you continue to see that problem. We'll make sure we can follow up. Okay, so my hope is that everyone is now seeing a slide that says, how do we think about short-term outcomes? Think to presenter. Ooh, I am learning all sorts of new skills here. Promise, let us know if that doesn't work and we can unshare and then reshare, but hoping that that works.
Thank you. I'll keep looking around.
Okay, I'm going to stop and reshare just so that you don't have to be caught. I mean, I love our faces, but that's not actually why you're here. Okay. Stop sharing. Stop presenting. Share. My team will tell me afterwards that this is why we always should do these things in Zoom. Okay. Do we see how do we think about short-term outcomes? Maybe?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Ah, and I'm seeing some thumbs up emojis too. Okay. Okay. Find our way back in. So because we want these outcomes to help us uplift your stories and evidence, how we go about this process is intentionally designed to center each partnership's community expertise. That, again, lovely rule of threes. There's about three ways, at least three ways that you can think about this. First is that we want you to be able to self-determine the outcomes that most resonate with your work. Secondly, ideally, these outcomes are ones that are directly in the path of your work, meaning you already measure them, or if they're new, measuring them will contribute to learning that your partnership will benefit from. If you can't do something with the learning that you would get from it, it's not the outcome we should be measuring for your work. And lastly, ideally, these are indicators where there's a reasonable potential for growth or improvement within a year. By way of example, if your work directly supports high school seniors, we wouldn't necessarily want to focus on college persistence because that's more than a year out from high school graduation. Likewise, short-term outcomes are likely best considered by thinking about those who receive direct support from you. That could be students getting direct support through mentorship, families getting direct support by attending community events, or community organizations becoming directly involved in what you do by way of the partnership itself. This is because even though systems change underlies the full theory of change, the long-term goal of increasing our educational attainment, that systems change rarely, if ever, occurs completely within a single year. It's the same reason why we're not going to anchor how a partnership is doing to those population level outcomes that we're required to report on. What this means for you as partnerships is that you have autonomy within your partnership to identify the right focal area for your work, whether that relates to the community members who you view as directly supported by it, which could be the partnership or learners or families, or the type of evidence that you want to collect to make the case that something is happening within this space. Maybe it's qualitative surveys or interviews. Maybe you're able to and would like to link to administrative data. Maybe you want to do interviews or focus groups. All of these are options that are available to you, and bonus points if there's something you're already doing and are directly in line with the outcomes that you're going to look at. I'm going to advance the slide and we're going to see what happens. Okay. We're good. Oh, yes, excellent. Okay. So sometimes this is easiest to grasp by way of example. So let's go ahead. Now I think I went too far and start there. How we develop outcomes is, as is true for most of the things we do, an iterative ongoing process. So we will learn things by developing these outcomes with you that will change how we do this in the future. We will learn by things that Jonathan comes and talks with me about after this, where I say, you're right, I think that we can improve that, let's shift that. So know that your feedback throughout this process will directly influence how this goes in subsequent iterations for yourselves and for other partners. In essence, though, the way the process operates right now is we break it into two parts. Part one is what you can think of as an individual level theory of change that surfaces your outcomes. And part two is what we call the sources of evidence. Those are the pieces of information that demonstrate progress is occurring within your chosen outcomes. So let's start with that part one, that individual level theory of change. The first step involves identifying the broad areas of work that your partnership is embarking on. In the example that's hopefully up right now, Let's say a partnership is piloting a new mentorship program. So that's one of its focal areas. Identifying what that individual level theory of change is requires surfacing your hypothesis for why you think this mentorship program will ultimately increase educational attainment. This is where I'm going to channel my inner 5-year-old and pretend she's home from school and ask why questions no matter how much detail you may provide. So let's say you start out by saying, a mentoring program for high school seniors can increase post-secondary educational attainment. Okay. Maeve would say, why? Well, because a high school senior who receives mentorship will be more likely to enroll in college. Why? Because being mentored might increase that high school senior's educational aspirations. Okay, but why is that? Well, because being mentored will help students feel that they have more support both academically and socio-emotionally. So you could almost kind of certainly add more layers to this, more and more questions of why, but these layers are more than sufficient. So let's pull out from that set of whys what I would consider to be your potential short-term outcomes. That would be mentorship for high school seniors can increase their reported levels of academic and socio-emotional support, increase their self-reported educational aspirations. It could also increase their college or job training enrollment directly after high school. All of those could be outcomes that your partnership might consider directly in the path of its mentorship pilot program. So that all sounds great, but how will you know whether the mentorship program is influencing high school seniors who receive that mentorship in the ways we just talked about on the previous slide? This is the part 2, and this is that sources of evidence piece. So before we dig into group participation time, let's pause for a moment first for questions that have come up at this point. We're 23 minutes in. You've heard primarily my voice. What questions have come up for you, or where are there places where you'd like to ask clarifying questions specifically on the why of these outcomes or on the pathway of change piece before we move into the evidence? Okay. We're going to now take 2 minutes to think about potential sources of evidence. So you have the 3 outcomes that we've talked about for this one in front of you. This is really just a chance to kind of start flexing this muscle. There's no homework, there's no pop quiz, though I did learn I could put a pop quiz poll in. We will not be doing that. But just kind of take a minute to think about what you might look at. This is for students who receive this mentorship. And it's worth noting that we in the RCG team take a really broad definition of evidence. So these don't have to be just quant measures or something you might call key performance indicators. If it's helpful, you could think about swapping out the word evidence for stories and see where that takes you. So I'm going to go on mute, and in about 90 seconds, I'll come back and we'll see if anyone wants to share some evidence forms that they've been thinking about. Okay, I may be a few seconds to the left or right of the goal time, but let's go ahead and talk about this first one, the increases in academic and socio-emotional support. If you feel comfortable, maybe drop in the chat, or even really comfortable, you could come off mute to share some thinkings that you had about what might look like evidence for this outcome. Who seek peer mentor sessions. And so what I see in that one too is sort of you could start to think about that as the trend line, the stories in the trend line, because I think on its own, it's possible that something like a count might tell you a little bit about demand and doesn't necessarily sort of connect it to this next piece. So then the next question is like, how could you look at that over time maybe? And would that show you that there's an increased desire for some of these connections that would allow you to tell the story across, for instance, like a student senior year? Other ideas? I was thinking about maybe like a short, maybe it's a 2 or 3 question survey at the start, like an onboarding question as they're being onboarded into the mentorship that asks about these 2 pieces. And then you can always ask it at the end of the year and kind of see how it's changed for students across the year through the mentorship. From interviews with students. By having, Christina, I see your hope assessment questions too, coming up with ways for folks to kind of reflect on how they're feeling about pieces. What about educational aspirations or even enrollment? Where are places where you might gather evidence for those? Life plans, like thinking maybe even there's some context in the high school and beyond plans that high schoolers fill out, which in this case we're talking about high school seniors, so that could work, thinking about that piece. We've had partnerships that pull out and adapt questions from the Panorama survey, which is openly available for folks to adapt, and that allows them to get at kind of specific things that they're hoping to improve. Mm-hmm. And I think, Krista, so sort of building on what you've noted, I think there's potential, maybe it's even like an after graduation focus group. So maybe you gather 5, 6 students who were part of that mentorship program after they've graduated from high school and ask them to reflect on the experiences, and you'll get quotes, rich quotes and responses that can maybe reflect some of where that learning has occurred, both in terms of their educational aspirations and in their socio-emotional and academic support. I think of the evidence as the sort of how do you know? Like, how do you know that what you've done has shifted something? I think there's space in these to say, I had a follow-up conversation, or a person sent me an email and they've said I could share this snippet and this is what the email says. And the name and the person are all anonymized, but the learning or the storytelling that they shared with you can become part of your larger way of knowing that what you're doing is influencing the students that you work with. So we'll go ahead. Yep. Love the idea of a pre and post survey, not to be too much of a nerd about it, but I do love some pre-posts. We'll go ahead and move. So I want you to get a chance to see the template where you'll use to start developing this. But this kind of bringing some of this openness and this exploration and this how might we to this process is exactly what we hope for you to feel like you have the space to do. We also take very seriously that partnerships should be owning not just the outcomes that they choose, but the interpretation of that learning and evidence, because these are your community's stories. And so we will always work hard to make sure that we honor that in the way that the storytelling that you do with us percolates into our public reporting. So I say that in the context of these forms of evidence, so you hear those 2 things together. The evidence is never going to be abstracted from the learners who it is part of. That is our goal, and we will work with you to make sure that that happens. So what exactly will you be doing in the next part? That will be a document that you will get after today's meeting. The RCG team will send you a document that looks like this. where essentially we ask you to spend some time thinking about what that individual level theory of change might look like. For the first part of this process, you are just going to focus on the gray box that's underneath that part 1 individual theory of change. And from that, the pieces that will go in that first column that is labeled short-term outcome. Writing the first part of that piece should necessarily surface the second part. So you should be able to write the first part and immediately see through that chain of whys things that might become part of your short-term outcomes. Then once you've done some brainstorming with that, each partnership, whomever it is on your partnership who will hold this process, it may be one of you, it may be 2 or 3 of you, will have a one-on-one conversation or a 3-on-1 conversation with me where you are talking through those together, coming to sort of agreement on what those might look like. You can take those back to your partnership. You certainly have space to build, and we want you to have space to build partnership consensus within that process. Then there'll be a second conversation where once we feel like the outcomes themselves feel strong and aligned with what you're doing, we'll dig into those sources of evidence. And that's where you'll get to spend a lot of time with me asking really wiry questions like, what would it look like if we did this? What kind of conversations do you have where you do this? And I'll bring myself back in and we'll sort of create boundaries around what I suggested, what we might do. But all of the goal of that is key learning that you can use and that isn't a burden because it's just reporting for the sake of reporting. So let's go into a few more examples just because I think it's really important to demonstrate that these outcomes don't just have to be student level outcomes. They can also be school level outcomes or they could even be community level outcomes. Let's start with school. So let's say you're implementing a culturally responsive professional development program, which you think will lead to school level increases in students' educational aspirations, high school seniors' FAFSA filing rates, and high school seniors' direct to college enrollment rates. So your theory of change you can see above is that this program does, staff and teachers participate in this program and it has these downstream consequences that lead to these increases in students' aspirations, financial aid filing, and college and job enrollment. That's your outcomes. What are some of the sources of evidence here? Thinking at the school level, what are pieces of evidence that you could gather, whether it's evidence you already gather, publicly available data you might be able to use, those same focus group surveys that could help you tell the story of this professional development program shaping students' experiences in these ways. Maybe the flip way to think about it too is like, how would you know if this professional development program is shaping students' aspirations? Not what the evidence says, not what you think you need to say when it comes to data and reporting, but how would you walk into the school and see that there's been a change in the way students aspire to navigate their educational journeys? Talking and listening. Yep. I think that's a really big part of it. Maybe you see shifts in the way they show up in class or in the way school staff talk about students' aspirations or, staff talk with students differently. Maybe it's as simple as looking at the FAFSA filing rates at the school level that are available on WSAC's website so that you can look at that overall and by key demographic subgroups. Yeah, there it is. Exactly that point of kind of using what's available so that it's not asking you to do more. If we already create publicly available school level FAFSA filing rates overall and by subgroups, let's use that so that you're not recreating a new wheel just to be able to look at increases in FAFSA filing rates for your students. We think it's a school level outcome, so we can look at it across the whole school. Likewise with college and job training enrollment. Those take some time to actually move through to reporting, but we have in publicly available data sources direct to college enrollment rates at the high school level. So that's something we can look at. And then if you want to supplement that, which I often do with some of the qualitative context, you can look and see, I love this, how CBOs and college staff show up to help students directly. Like the increased presence of folks within schools having conversations. You can start to dig into what this might look like. That's not just sort of traditional, or traditional is the wrong word, like capturing a single dimension of it. The school level equivalent of what is the weather today and how does it make you feel if you were. All right, we're going to do one more example. So I really encourage you all to flex your willingness to drop some stuff in the chat and think through. But it's also possible that you will feel like, based on where your partnerships work is, that there's a community or a partnership level outcome that you'd like to focus on. And so in this example, what I'm talking about is the partnership is engaging in community listening sessions as part of a strategic planning period. And they hypothesize that this engagement with the community will enable the partnership to provide programming that better aligns with community needs, that improves its connections to and trust with community members, and that provides community members with a sense of ownership and agency over how they approach their educational decisions. So what are some of the sources of evidence that the partnership might be able to collect for their partnership level outcomes, which is a totally different space from a student or a school level outcome? And again, think of the framing as sort of, how would you as a partnership know that the programming that you're offering your community aligns with what they need and prefer and how they view and show up to the work? Like, how do you know that when you're doing that, it's what they need? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. New and different community members, bringing more of their family members, seeing success in the terms of who they serve as their client base, looking at needs and wants surveys and attendance records. I even, like, it's so simple, but looking at attendance records over time, I think, can tell you a really dynamic story of how a partnership or an organization shows up in their piece. What I love, this is like a sidebar, I love how much activity and excitement there is around figuring out what this looks like at the partnership level, because candidly, this is the space where I spend the most time thinking, how do I do this? And what you've just shown me is that this is your strength and your bread and butter. And so the fact that there's this much creativity coming in has me so excited for thinking about what partnership level and community level outcomes might look like in this cohort of folks. Engagement on social media, locations of activities moving based on feedback from partners. I love that. All of those are direct reflections of how you all show up in your communities, and all of this is evidence. Just a question of how we document it so that we can tell that story upward and make the case for what you all are doing in your work on the ground. Okay, so yes, I just want to leave this part up and let you all keep talking, but I will walk you through the timeline process just so that you have a sense of what's coming from here. The next several months are really just going to focus on that process of identifying your focal areas and those potential outcomes and surfacing your sources of evidence. So our hope is that all partnerships will have gone through these two steps by the end of 2024. Then next year, we will move to translating these outcomes and these sources of evidence into a sort of formal or sort of a more scaffolded reporting template so that you know exactly what will be expected of you next fall when you first report on your short-term outcomes. And what I mean when I say this is that we view it as our responsibility to design the reporting infrastructure that aligns with the outcomes that your partnership chooses. It is not on you to look across these outcomes and figure out how to synthesize all of it. So we will walk hand in hand with you to say, okay, if you've said you're going to have these pieces of evidence, you're asking a survey that has these two questions, just like, let's have a chart, or let's have you pull out these 2 data points, or let's have you pull out a few rich quotes from some of those interviews, or let's have you talk about attendance across these community events over time. Not do the reporting, but create the infrastructure that allows you to demonstrate that story without it having to happen in real time at the end of an academic or midway through an academic year, right before the start of an academic year. We'll then have you submit those first academic year outcomes, which will be for the 24-25 academic year, in fall of next year. And then in the winter spring of 2026, if you can even fathom being that far ahead in time, we'll revisit all of this, because if something you report on or an outcome you chose doesn't work with how the partnership is functioning on the ground, that needs to be changed. And we want to walk alongside you as you change that so that your learning going forward is oriented to the work that your partnership seeks to do. So you will receive from RCG in the coming days an email that includes the short-term outcomes development template, as well as guidance on how to schedule your partnership's first one-on-one session to discuss these outcomes. Today, if you do find that you already have questions that you know you'll want to ask as part of that one-on-one session, we are reserving this last 20 minutes of our time for breakout rooms where both Jonathan and I are available to chat with you. We'll open those up. I have a little bit of sorting to make sure folks can get into different rooms. But know that if you aren't the one in your partnership who will be working with us on these outcomes, or if you don't feel ready to engage, you can go ahead and feel like you can drop off the call, send us a note with follow-up questions afterwards, but we're going to hold this space in these breakout rooms for folks to be able to come together. So as we set those up, and before we go into the final stat space, this has been a lot of context, and maybe this process mirrors what you've done in other contexts, or maybe it's a fully new approach that you haven't taken. Regardless of that, I want to give us a space to pause so that you can wrap up, ask questions or clarifications that you would like to have provided in this moment, knowing that additional questions are almost always going to surface as this reflection process unfolds. So I'm going to open up some breakout rooms in just a moment, but want to leave space for everybody to be able to ask questions to the full group before we do that. All right, I'm going to go ahead and open these rooms. Like I said, if you feel like now is not, you're not quite ready to ask questions, or you're not sure what those questions would be or who it is in your group, know that we completely understand. We will share the recording out afterwards, but also know that both Jonathan and I will be available to answer any questions today and in follow-up email afterwards. So see if I can do this correctly. Nope, I need to open. They should be opening.